There was a moment in the history of human thought when a group of people decided that the time had come to stop tolerating, not to reform, not to criticize constructively, not to suggest improvements, to stop tolerating. The target was an entire 2,500-year tradition of philosophical speculation about the deepest questions of existence. Questions about God, about the soul, about the ultimate nature of reality, about time, space, causality, free will. Questions that had occupied humanity's brightest minds for millennia. And this group's sentence was simple and brutal. All of this is rubbish. I don't rubbish in the sense of being wrong. Trash in the sense of saying nothing, of being noise, of being language going wrong, producing sounds that look like knowledge but are completely empty of real cognitive content. This group became known as the Vienna Circle, and the instrument they constructed to enforce the ruling became known as the verifiability principle. And for a few decades of the 20th century, this principle seemed the most powerful and cleanest of philosophical razors, a tool that cut out 2.5 millennia of useless speculation at once and left only what was genuinely knowable. But what happened next is one of the most instructive and most ironic stories in human intellectual history, because the razor that was constructed to destroy metaphysics turned out, on closer examination, to be so sharp that it cut itself. To understand what was happening, we need to go back to the historical context. The end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century were decades of unprecedented intellectual revolution. Einstein had published the theory of special relativity in 1905 and the theory of general relativity in 1915, showing that space and time were not the fixed, absolute stages that Newton had imagined, but dynamic structures that curved and deformed in response to mass and energy. Quantum mechanics was being constructed by Bohr, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, and Dirac, revealing a subatomic universe where particles had no defined positions and velocities before they were observed, where classical causality seemed to break down, where reality refused to be what common sense expected it to be. Simultaneously, mathematics was being placed on new and rigorous foundations. Gottlob Frege had developed predicate logic, a formal system of inference far more powerful than the Aristotelian logic that had dominated for 2 millennia. Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead had published Principia Mathematica, a monumental attempt to derive all mathematics from pure logical principles. David Hilbert had proposed his program, which aimed to prove that mathematics was both complete, in the sense that every mathematical truth could be proven within the system, and consistent, in the sense that the system would never lead to contradictions. It was a moment of intellectual euphoria. Science was advancing in a way that seemed unstoppable. Logic was being mathematized. The math was being grounded. It seemed that human reason was finally finding a method that worked, that produced genuine, cumulative knowledge about the real world. And in this context, traditional philosophy seemed increasingly obsolete, increasingly an anachronism, a set of questions that did not move forward because, deep down, there was nothing there to advance. It was in this climate that a group of philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists began to meet informally in Vienna in the early 20s. The group included Moritz Schlick, who was a professor of philosophy and the informal intellectual leader of the group, Rudolf Carnap, who would be the most systematic and rigorous of its members, Otto Neurath, who was the most politically engaged and the most interested in the social applications of the group's ideas, Hans Reichenbach in Berlin, and several others. They read together Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, published in 1921, and discussed its implications for philosophy and science. The Tractatus was an extraordinary and enigmatic book. Wittgenstein wrote it during the First World War, in trenches and battlefields, and it contained an insight into the relationship between language and the world that seemed at once clarifying and devastating. Language, Wittgenstein argued, consists of propositions that represent facts about the world. A proposition makes sense to the extent that it is a possible figuration of a state of affairs in the world. The propositions of logic and mathematics are special cases. They are tautologies, true in all circumstances, and therefore they say nothing about the world. They are just the formal structure of thought. And the questions of metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, what is good and what is beautiful, these questions are beyond the limits of what can be said. They can be shown, but not said. And what you cannot talk about, you must remain silent. Members of the Vienna Circle read the Tractatus as a confirmation and deepening of their own intuitions. If meaningful language is that which represents facts about the world, then the criterion of a proposition's meaning is its empirical verifiability. A proposition says something cognitively significant if and only if there is some possible experience that could confirm or refute it. Verifiable propositions are scientific propositions. Unverifiable propositions are either logical tautologies, such as 2 plus 2 equals 4, or pseudo-propositions with no cognitive content, such as God is eternal or ultimate reality is absolute spirit. This formulation, which became known as the verifiability criterion or empiricist criterion of meaning, was a weapon of intellectual mass destruction. Applied to the history of philosophy, it eliminated not only natural theology, but practically all Western metaphysics. It eliminated Plato's statements about the world of forms. It eliminated Aristotle's categories of substance and essence. It eliminated the proofs of the existence of God from Anselm and Thomas Aquinas. He eliminated the philosophy of Hegel's spirit. It eliminated Schopenhauer's metaphysics of will. It eliminated Heidegger's being and time. All these works, which represent centuries of intellectual effort by some of the greatest thinkers in history, would simply be pseudo-philosophy, language without content, sophisticated noise. Rudolf Carnap, in a 1932 article called The Overcoming of Metaphysics Through the Logical Analysis of Language, executed this sentence with a precision that was considered by many to be devastating. He took Heidegger's famous passage about nothingness, the nothing that swims, and analyzed it word for word, showing that it violated the basic rules of any meaningful language. Nothing, Carnap argued, is an indefinite pronoun that only has meaning in contexts, such as there is nothing in the box, where it operates as an existential negation. Transforming nothing into a subject that performs actions, that swims, is a grammatical error disguised as philosophical depth. It's like trying to make a statement about the present king of France, when France has no king, and pretending that this is a substantive statement about the world. Carnap's conclusion was clear. Metaphysics was not a discipline that was asking the right questions and arriving at the wrong answers. It was a discipline that wasn't even asking genuine questions. Its practitioners were, unwittingly, poets without poetic talent, people who had impulses to express emotional attitudes towards the world, but who, instead of writing poetry or music, wrote philosophical treatises that pretended to be knowledge. The elegant brutality of this argument had an enormous effect. Logical positivism, as the movement centered on the Vienna Circle became dominant in English language philosophy during the 30s, 40s, and 50s, especially after many of its members fled Europe because of Nazism and settled in American and British universities. A.J. Ayer published Language, Truth, and Logic in 1936, an accessible and brilliant presentation of logical positivism that became one of the most widely read philosophy books of the 20th century. An entire generation of students was formed with the conviction that metaphysics was a pseudo-problem dissolved by logical analysis. And then the problems started to appear. Not external problems, not criticisms coming from defensive metaphysicians who didn't want to see their fields destroyed. Internal, logical problems that emerged from the very heart of the verifiability criterion when it was subjected to the kind of rigorous analysis that the Vienna Circle demanded of everything else. The first and most devastating problem was simple. The verifiability criterion does not pass its own test. Is the claim that a proposition has cognitive meaning only if it is empirically verifiable itself empirically verifiable? What kind of experience could confirm or refute the verifiability criterion? No possible experiment could do this, because the criterion is not a statement about facts in the world. It is a proposal about how to use language, about what we will call meaningful and what we will call empty. If the verifiability criterion is not verifiable, then by its own criterion, it is cognitively meaningless. It's a pseudo-proposition. The instrument constructed to destroy metaphysics is itself metaphysical, or at least non-empirical in the relevant sense, the razor cut itself. Members of the Vienna Circle were aware of this problem and attempted reformulations. Carnap suggested that the criterion should not be understood as a true statement about language, but rather as a pragmatic proposal, a suggestion of how we should use language if we wanted to do science. But this greatly undermined the strength of the original argument. If the criterion is just one proposal, then metaphysicians can simply say that they prefer a different proposal. The death sentence of metaphysics became a taste preference. Other reformulations attempted to save the spirit of the criterion by modifying the letter. Instead of direct verifiability, some have proposed gradual confirmability. A proposition has meaning if possible observations can increase or decrease our confidence in it. But this formulation was either too liberal, admitting metaphysical propositions that can be supported by evidence in indirect ways, or too restrictive, excluding legitimate scientific claims that are not directly verifiable. No version of the criteria managed to do exactly what it promised. The problem of universal claims was particularly acute. All of physics is full of laws of the form that all objects with mass attract each other, or the speed of light in a vacuum is always the same. These claims cannot be conclusively verified because you can never observe all objects with mass or measure the speed of light in all possible circumstances. You can only check particular cases. If the verifiability criterion requires conclusive confirmation, then the most fundamental scientific laws are meaningless. But if you relax the criterion to allow partial confirmation, you open the door to metaphysical claims that can also be partially confirmed by evidence. Karl Popper, who knew the Vienna Circle but was never a member and disagreed on fundamental points, proposed an alternative solution that turned out to be much more influential than the verifiability criterion. Instead of verifiability, the demarcation criterion between science and non-science should be falsifiability. A theory is scientific if there is some possible observation that could disprove it. Einstein's theory of relativity is scientific because it makes specific predictions that could be found wrong by experiments. Astrology is not scientific because it can be adjusted to accommodate any outcome. But Popper was explicit that falsifiability was a criterion of demarcation between science and non-science, not a criterion of meaning. Unfalsifiable statements can be significant. They may even be true. They are simply not scientific. Metaphysics, for Popper, was not meaningless. It was pre-scientific in the sense that its claims could not be directly tested, but it could be rational and could even be important to science itself, providing research programs and worldviews that guided scientific work. This distinction by Popper was crucial. She separated two questions that the Vienna Circle had confused: the question of what counts as science and the question of what has meaning. Logical positivism had assumed that these two questions had the same answer. Popper showed that this was not the case. And this separation opened space to rehabilitate metaphysics as a meaningful enterprise, even if not scientific in the narrow sense. The most devastating criticism of logical positivism, however, came from within the very analytical and empirical tradition that the Vienna Circle claimed as its own. WVO. Quine, the American philosopher who was deeply committed to naturalism and science, published in 1951 an article called Two Dogmas of Empiricism that attacked the foundations of the positivist program with a precision that few have managed to respond satisfactorily. Quine identified two fundamental dogmas of empiricism. The first was the distinction between analytical truths, true in virtue of the meaning of words, and synthetic truths, true or false in virtue of the facts of the world. The positivists had based their entire vision on this distinction. Logic and mathematics were analytical, therefore true without needing to appeal to experience, while science was synthetic and empirically verifiable. Metaphysics was neither one thing nor the other, therefore it was meaningless. Quine argued that the analytic-synthetic distinction is fundamentally unclear. What does it mean that a proposition is true in virtue of meaning? Meaning is a concept that, when you try to analyze it rigorously, slips in disturbing ways. Synonyms are defined in terms of meaning, but meaning is defined in terms of synonymy. The circle is vicious. There is no sharp boundary between what pertains to the meaning of an expression and what pertains to the facts we believe about the world. The second dogma was reductionism, the idea that every meaningful statement can be translated into or verified by a specific set of sensory experiences. Quine argued that the affirmations do not face experience individually, but in groups. When an experiment appears to disprove a theory, you always have options. Abandon the theory, modify auxiliary hypotheses, question the measuring instruments. There is no one-to-one correspondence between propositions and the experiences that verify them. Quine's conclusion was that human knowledge is a web of beliefs facing experience as a whole, not proposition for proposition. The beliefs on the periphery of the web, the specific empirical hypotheses, are the easiest to revise when experience contradicts them. The beliefs at the center, the logical and mathematical truths, are the hardest to abandon because changing any one of them requires cascading changes throughout the network. But there is no proposition that is absolutely immune to revision in the light of experience, including logical truths, and there is no sharp boundary between the empirical and the non-empirical, between the scientific and the metaphysical. This did not mean that all propositions were equally justified. It meant that the simple, binary criterion of logical positivism, meaningful if verifiable, meaningless if unverifiable, was a gross simplification that did not capture the real complexity of the relationship between language, theory, and experience. While all this was happening within analytic philosophy, another line of attack on logical positivism was being developed from an unexpected direction. Wittgenstein himself, whose early work had inspired the movement, had completely abandoned the vision of the Tractatus and developed in his philosophical investigations, published posthumously in 1953, a radically different philosophy. Instead of seeing language as a system of representing facts, Wittgenstein came to see it as a collection of social practices, with multiple uses and functions, describing as just one of the many language games that humans play. Praying, commanding, telling stories, expressing emotions, writing poetry, these are all legitimate uses of language that cannot be reduced to the model of verifiable description of facts. Within this new view, the positivist attempt to reduce all meaning to the model of empirical verification was itself a philosophical confusion of the kind that Wittgenstein wanted to dispel. It was taking a specific language game, the scientific description of facts, and trying to transform it into the only model of legitimate linguistic use, ignoring the richness and variety of the real uses of language in concrete human practices. The result of all this was that logical positivism, as a philosophical program, collapsed within the space of a few decades. He was not defeated by defensive metaphysicians who resisted his criticism. He was destroyed from within by his own standards of rigor, when those standards were applied to the program himself with the same ruthlessness with which he had applied them to metaphysics. Metaphysics survived, more than survived. In the decades following the collapse of logical positivism, analytic metaphysics flourished in extraordinary ways. Saul Kripke published Naming and Necessity in 1972, which transformed the philosophy of language and metaphysics and opened new horizons for questions about essence, necessity, and identity. David Lewis developed modal realism, one of the boldest and most rigorous metaphysical views of the 20th century, according to which all possible worlds are equally real. Alvin Plantinga applied the tools of modal logic to the philosophy of religion with a rigor that logical positivists would have admired, even if they didn't like the conclusions. Ontology has become one of the most active and technically sophisticated fields in contemporary philosophy. What the history of logical positivism teaches us is something that goes far beyond the destiny of a specific philosophical movement. She teaches us about what happens when thought tries to establish its own definitive limits. Every time someone proposes a criterion like only this counts as real knowledge, or only that counts as meaningful language, the most fearsome critic is not the external opponent. It is the criterion itself, when applied to itself with the rigor it demands of everything else. Logical positivism tried to destroy metaphysics with a logical razor. And metaphysics survived because the razor wasn't as sharp as it seemed, but something more important remained: the awareness that any intellectual enterprise, including science itself, is founded on presuppositions that are not themselves completely verifiable, completely justifiable from the enterprise's internal point of view. That human knowledge is always a gamble, always a choice of which questions to ask and which criteria to use to evaluate them, and that this choice is not itself determined by any neutral and universal criteria. This is a conclusion that the Vienna Circle J.I. would have accepted it, but it is the conclusion that the failure of his most ambitious project left us as a legacy, and it is perhaps more valuable than any success would have been.